Jane sat quietly in the corner of her small apartment, staring at her phone. The screen was lit with a message from Tony, her boyfriend of 3 years. He was asking if they could meet and talk about their future. Jane had been avoiding this conversation for weeks. Tony was a good man, kind, hardworking, and deeply in love with her. But lately, her heart had been drawn elsewhere. Her thoughts drifted to Mr. Richard Daniels, a wealthy businessman she had met at an upscale bar where her friend, Clara, worked. He was older, confident, and incredibly charming. Unlike Tony, who was struggling to save up for a house, Richard lived in a world of luxury. Fancy cars, expensive suits, and a magnetic personality that made Jane feel special. She knew he was married, but the way he looked at her made her believe she was different. Tony called her again, and she reluctantly answered. "Jane, can we talk? I feel like you're slipping away," Tony said, his voice full of concern. "I just need some time, Tony," she replied, her tone distant. That evening, Richard invited Jane out to dinner. The restaurant was exquisite, the kind of place Jane had only seen in movies. As they shared a bottle of fine wine, Richard leaned closer. "Jane, you deserve more than a small apartment and a boyfriend who can't give you the life you want," he said smoothly. Jane felt a pang of guilt but also a thrill. Richard made her feel like she belonged in his world. Days turned into weeks, and Jane's visits to Tony grew less frequent. One evening, she met him at their usual spot, a quiet park where they often talked about their dreams. "Are you breaking up with me?" Tony asked, his voice trembling. "I think we need to go our separate ways," Jane said, avoiding his gaze. Tony was devastated. "Jane, I love you. I can give you the world. Just give me time." But Jane had already made up her mind. The allure of Richard's lifestyle was too strong. She moved into a new apartment that Richard paid for and became his lover. At first, everything seemed perfect. He showered her with gifts and attention, making her feel like a queen. But as the weeks went by, Jane began to notice cracks in his charming facade. Richard was controlling. He decided when they could meet and where she could go. His promises of leaving his wife started to sound hollow. But Jane pushed those doubts aside, believing that he truly cared for her. One night, Jane felt nauseous and fainted in the bathroom. A trip to the doctor confirmed what she had suspected. She was pregnant. First, Jane panicked. But then she saw the pregnancy as an opportunity. She believed that the baby would strengthen her bond with Richard, perhaps even convince him to leave his wife for her. When she told Richard the news, his reaction was not what she expected. He smiled faintly and said, "I'll take care of everything. But understand this. I can never leave my wife." Jane felt a sinking feeling in her chest. She had expected joy, maybe even a plan for their future together. Instead, she realized she was just a piece of Richard's hidden life. Despite her doubts, Jane convinced herself that everything would work out. She believed Richard loved her in his own way. But deep down, a seed of regret began to grow, and she couldn't shake the memory of Tony, how he had loved her unconditionally. As the months passed, Jane's life became more complicated. She was stuck between the man she had left behind and the one who refused to truly be hers. And with each passing day, she felt the weight of her decisions pressing down on her. Months rolled by, and Jane's pregnancy became more visible. The once exciting world Richard had introduced her to now felt like a gilded cage. His calls came less frequently, and when they did, they were short and devoid of the warmth she once craved. Jane tried to bring up the future several times, but Richard dismissed her concerns with the same words. "I told you I'll take care of everything." One evening, Jane mustered the courage to confront him. She had grown tired of his vague promises. "Richard, we need to talk," she said as they sat in her apartment. "About what?" he asked, scrolling through his phone, barely glancing at her. "This baby, our baby. What happens after I give birth? Where do we stand?" Richard sighed heavily and put his phone down. "Jane, I've told you this before. I'll make sure you and the baby are taken care of financially, but I can't disrupt my family. My wife, she's been through too much. I can't hurt her." Jane felt her heart drop. "So what am I supposed to do?" Raise this child alone. No, he said sharply. The child will come with me. Jane froze, her mind reeling. What do you mean with you? I mean, I'll take the baby. My wife and I will raise it. You'll be free to move on with your life. No, absolutely not. Jane shouted, her voice trembling with anger and fear. Richard leaned forward, his tone icy. Don't forget who you're dealing with, Jane. This isn't up for debate. I have the resources, the influence. You can't give this child the life it deserves. I can. Jane felt trapped. She knew Richard's power. He had connections that could make life difficult, even dangerous, for her. She decided to drop the argument for now, but her resentment toward him grew. As her due date approached, Jane became more isolated. Richard's visits were rare, and when he did come, it was to ensure she had the medical care she needed. He showed no interest in her well-being beyond that. Clara, her friend, tried to check in on her, but Jane pushed her away, ashamed of the choices she had made. One evening, Jane sat alone in her apartment, staring at an old photo of her and Tony. It was from a trip to the beach, a day filled with laughter and dreams about their future. Tears streamed down her face. She had traded that love for a life that now felt hollow. The day of her delivery arrived, and Richard was there at the hospital, acting every bit the supportive partner. But the moment Jane held her baby girl in her arms, she felt a fierce protectiveness she hadn't expected. She's perfect, Jane whispered, tears of joy and heartbreak mingling. But her joy was short-lived. Hours after the delivery, Richard came into the room with a solemn expression. It's time, he said. Jane clutched the baby tighter. No, you can't take her from me. Richard's expression darkened. Don't make this harder than it needs to be, Jane. You agreed to this. I never agreed to give up my child, she screamed. Richard stepped closer, his voice low and threatening. If you try to fight me on this, you'll regret it. Don't forget. I know things about you, things that can ruin you. And if you dare to speak a word about any of this, I won't just ruin you. I'll make sure you disappear. Terrified and powerless, Jane watched helplessly as Richard took her daughter from her arms. Her cries echoed through the hospital room, but no one came to help. Richard returned home with the baby, feeding his wife a carefully constructed lie. She's an orphan, he told her. The mother died in childbirth. No relatives to claim her. I couldn't let the child end up in the system. His wife, a kind-hearted woman, believed him. She named the baby Emma and raised her as her own, pouring all her love into the child. Meanwhile, Jane was left alone, devastated and hollow. Every day, she replayed the moment Richard took her daughter, hating herself for trusting him. She realized too late that Richard was not the man she thought he was. He was selfish, manipulative, and cruel. Her health began to deteriorate. The stress, guilt, and heartbreak took a toll on her body and mind. As the months passed, Jane sank deeper into despair, haunted by the life she had chosen and the love she had lost. Jane's days blurred into nights as she struggled to move forward without her daughter. Every time she saw a child in the park or heard a baby's cry, her chest ached with longing and despair. The walls of her apartment felt like a prison, a constant reminder of her choices. Her only visitor was Clara, who refused to give up on her friend despite being pushed away. One evening, Clara found Jane sitting in the dark, a half-eaten meal on the table. Jane, you can't keep living like this, Clara said, switching on the lights. I don't have anything to live for. Clara, Jane whispered, her voice hollow. That's not true. You're still here and you can start over. You can start over. Jane snapped, her voice rising. Do you know what I've done? I gave up a man who loved me for someone who took everything from me. My child, Clara. He took my child and left me with nothing. Clara sat beside her, taking her hand. You need to fight back, Jane. Speak out. Tell someone. I can't, Jane said, shaking her head. He threatened me. He said he'd ruin me. Or worse. Clara's eyes filled with sympathy, but she also knew Jane's fear was justified. Richard was a powerful man, and going against him could have serious consequences. Months turned into years, and Jane's health continued to decline. She rarely left her apartment, her once vibrant spirit now a shadow of itself. She began to reflect on her life, her mistakes, and the people she had hurt, especially Tony. One rainy afternoon, Jane found herself holding an old journal. Flipping through its pages, she stumbled upon a poem Tony had written for her during their happier days. You are the light in my darkest days, the calm in my stormy nights. With you I see a brighter tomorrow, a love that feels just right. Tears streamed down her face as she clutched the journal to her chest. She realized she had not only lost her daughter but also the man who had truly loved her. Meanwhile, Richard's life continued as if nothing had happened. He resumed his affairs, maintaining the illusion of a perfect family life with his wife and their adopted daughter, Emma. His wife adored Emma, blissfully unaware of the truth about her origins. But cracks began to form in Richard's carefully constructed life. A business deal went sour, and rumors of his infidelity began circulating among his peers. Despite his charm and influence, Richard was no longer untouchable. 2 years after losing her daughter, Jane was confined to her bed, her body weakened by illness and her spirit weighed down by regret. She knew she didn't have much time left. Desperate to make amends, she picked up a pen and began to write a letter to Tony. Her hand trembled as she poured her heart onto the page. Dear Tony, I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I need to tell you the truth before it's too late. I was pregnant when I left you, but I didn't tell you because I thought I was doing what was best for the baby. I was wrong. I fell for a man who promised me the world but only brought me pain. He took our child, your child, from me. Her name is Emma, and she's being raised by his wife. She doesn't know about us. I'm so sorry, Tony. I should have trusted you. I should have stayed with you. Please find our daughter. Love her the way I couldn't, and tell her I'm sorry. The address is... Jane wrote the address where Emma could be found and sealed the letter with trembling hands. Clara agreed to deliver it for her, seeing the urgency in Jane's eyes. You'll make sure he gets it, right? Jane asked, her voice barely a whisper. I promise, Clara said, holding back tears. That night, Jane closed her eyes for the last time. The weight of her regret finally lifted as she hoped for Tony to do what she no longer could. The next day, Clara mailed the letter, unaware of the chain of events it would set in motion. Tony sat at his desk, staring at a stack of unpaid bills. Life had not been kind to him since Jane left. He had tried to move on, but every relationship felt hollow, every moment shadowed by her absence. He often wondered what had gone wrong, what had made her trade their simple but honest love for a life he couldn't compete with. A knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. He opened it to find the mail carrier holding a weathered envelope. This came for you, the man said, handing it over. Tony frowned, noting the shaky handwriting on the envelope. As he tore it open, his eyes scanned the letter, and his hands began to tremble. Dear Tony, the words hit him like a thunderbolt. Jane's confession poured out before him, each sentence unraveling a truth he hadn't been prepared for. He sank into a chair, the letter clutched tightly in his hands. The mention of her pregnancy, their child, and the man who had taken everything from her left him reeling. She had my baby, Tony whispered, his voice choked with emotion. As he read further, he found the address Jane had written, the place where his daughter was living. A mix of anger, heartbreak, and determination surged within him. He couldn't change the past, but he could fight for his child, just as Jane had begged him to. The next day, Tony took the letter and traveled to the address Jane had provided. It was a grand house in an affluent neighborhood, worlds apart from the life he had known. He hesitated at the gate, his heart pounding. This is it, he muttered to himself. Gathering his courage, he rang the doorbell. A woman in her late 30s, with kind eyes and a warm smile, answered. Can I help you? She asked. My name is Tony, he began, holding out the letter. I need to speak to you about a little girl named Emma. The woman's smile faltered. What about her? Tony took a deep breath. She's my daughter. Inside the house, the woman, whose name was Margaret, sat across from Tony, holding the letter he had handed her. Her face turned pale as she read Jane's words. "This can't be true," Margaret said, her voice shaking. "My husband told me Emma was an orphan. He said her mother died in childbirth and that there were no relatives." Tony's jaw tightened. "Your husband lied to you. Jane was her mother, and I'm her father." Margaret looked at him, her eyes wide with confusion and hurt. "How do I know this isn't some kind of mistake?" "I'm willing to prove it," Tony said firmly. "The DNA test will show that Emma is my daughter." Margaret hesitated, the weight of the situation pressing down on her. She loved Emma deeply and couldn't imagine life without her. But she couldn't ignore the possibility that her husband had deceived her. "All right," she said finally. "We'll do the test." That evening, Margaret confronted Richard about Tony's claims. "There's a man who says Emma is his daughter," Margaret said, holding out the letter. Richard barely glanced at it. "It's nonsense. He's lying." Margaret's eyes narrowed. "Are you sure? Because he seems very certain, and he's agreed to a DNA test." Richard scoffed. "Let him waste his time. The child has no relatives. She's ours, Margaret. Don't let some stranger ruin our family." But his dismissive tone only deepened her suspicion. The following week, Tony and Emma underwent DNA testing. As they waited for the results, Margaret grew more uneasy. She loved Emma deeply, but she couldn't shake the feeling that Richard had been hiding something from her all along. When the DNA results came in, they confirmed what Tony had claimed. He was Emma's biological father. Margaret sat in stunned silence, the document in her hands. She looked at Tony, then at Richard, who stood rigid and defensive. "This can't be right," Richard said, his voice cold. "There's been a mistake." Margaret's eyes filled with tears. "Stop lying, Richard. The test doesn't lie. What else have you been hiding from me? I don't know what kind of scam this man is pulling, but I'm telling you, Emma doesn't have any relatives." Richard insisted, but Margaret saw through him now. His denial, his defensiveness, it all added up. She remembered the inconsistencies in his story, the evasive way he had answered her questions when Emma first came into their lives. "You've been lying to me this whole time," Margaret said, her voice breaking. "How could you? How could you bring this child into our home and tell me she was an orphan?" Richard had no answer. He stormed out of the room, leaving Margaret alone with the truth. Margaret turned to Tony, her expression filled with pain and regret. "I'm sorry. I didn't know. I love Emma with all my heart, but she's your daughter. She deserves to know the truth, and so do you." As Tony prepared to meet Emma for the first time, his heart was filled with hope and sorrow. He thought of Jane, of the sacrifices she had made and the pain she had endured. He vowed to honor her last wish, to love and care for their daughter. Tony's hands trembled as he stood in the living room of Margaret's house, waiting to meet his daughter. The room was cozy, filled with pictures of Emma. Her bright smile in the photographs tugged at his heart. Margaret entered, holding Emma's hand. The little girl had dark curls and big brown eyes that reminded Tony of Jane. She looked up at him curiously, clutching a stuffed bunny. "Emma," Margaret said gently, kneeling beside her. "This is Tony. He's someone very special." Tony knelt to Emma's level, his voice soft. "Hi, Emma. It's so nice to meet you." Emma tilted her head. "Are you Mama's friend?" Tony's throat tightened, but he managed a nod. "Yes, I knew your Mama. She was a wonderful person." Emma's eyes lit up. "Mama's in heaven. Daddy says she watches over me." Tony felt a pang of sadness but smiled. "She does. She loved you very much." Emma reached out and placed her little hand in his. "You're nice. Can you play tea party with me?" Tony laughed softly. "I'd love to." Margaret watched the interaction from a distance, her heart heavy with conflicting emotions. She had loved Emma as her own, but now she faced the reality that Emma had a father who had been kept from her. After Emma went to bed, Margaret and Tony sat down to discuss what came next. "She's a wonderful child," Tony said, his voice filled with emotion. "She is," Margaret agreed, "and she loves it here. This has been her home for 2 years. I don't want to uproot her life completely, Tony. I know she's your daughter, but..." Tony nodded. I don't want to take her away from the only home she's known, but I want to be in her life. I want her to know her father. Margaret hesitated before replying, I think that's fair. She deserves to know you, but I'll need time to explain it to her. I don't want to overwhelm her. Tony agreed, grateful for Margaret's understanding. Despite the tension between them, they shared a common goal, Emma's happiness. Meanwhile, Richard grew increasingly distant. He avoided Margaret and refused to address the growing evidence against him. Margaret knew she couldn't ignore the cracks in her marriage any longer. One evening, she confronted him again. You need to tell me the truth, Richard, she demanded. Why did you lie about Emma? Why did you bring her into our home and tell me she was an orphan? Richard's face hardened. I did what I thought was best. You wanted a child, and Emma needed a home. Does it matter how she got here? It matters that you lied, Margaret shot back. It matters that you've been unfaithful and deceitful. I can't live like this anymore. Richard tried to brush her off, but Margaret had made up her mind. I'm filing for divorce, she said firmly. I won't stay in a marriage built on lies. Richard stared at her, his arrogance faltering for the first time. But Margaret didn't wait for his response. She walked away, determined to rebuild her life without him. In the weeks that followed, Tony began spending more time with Emma. He took her to the park, read her bedtime stories, and listened to her excitedly talk about her favorite toys and cartoons. One afternoon, Emma turned to him with a serious expression. Are you my new daddy? Tony's heart ached, but he smiled gently. I'm your daddy, Emma. I always have been. I just didn't get to meet you until now. Emma thought about this for a moment, then hugged him tightly. I'm glad you're here. Tears welled in Tony's eyes as he held her close. For the first time in years, he felt whole again. Margaret watched their bond grow with mixed emotions. She loved Emma deeply but knew it was time to let go. Tony, she said one evening, I think Emma belongs with you. You're her father, and she needs to be with you. Tony was taken aback. Margaret, I don't want to take her away from you. You've been her mother in every way that matters. Margaret shook her head, tears streaming down her face. I'll always love her, but she deserves to be with her real family. And I need to start over, too. Tony nodded, understanding the sacrifice Margaret was making. As Tony prepared to bring Emma home, he thought of Jane and the sacrifices she had made. He promised himself he would give their daughter the life Jane had dreamed of. Richard's life was unraveling quickly. Margaret had filed for divorce, and Tony's presence in Emma's life was growing stronger. But Richard remained stubborn, denying any wrongdoing and maintaining that Tony was a liar trying to disrupt their family. One evening, Tony decided to confront Richard directly. He arrived at the house with the DNA results and Jane's letter in hand, determined to expose the truth once and for all. Richard opened the door, his expression cold. What are you doing here? We need to talk, Tony said firmly. Margaret appeared behind Richard, her face tense. Let him in, she said. Richard reluctantly stepped aside, and Tony walked into the living room. He placed the DNA test results and the letter on the coffee table. Stop lying, Richard, Tony said. The proof is right here. Emma is my daughter. Jane's letter and the DNA test confirm it. Richard scoffed, crossing his arms. This doesn't prove anything. That letter could be fake, and DNA tests aren't always accurate. Margaret glared at him. Stop insulting my intelligence. Richard, you've been lying to me for years. I know the truth now. Richard's face darkened, but he refused to back down. You're letting this man manipulate you. He's just trying to take Emma away. Margaret's voice trembled with anger. The only manipulator here is you. How could you bring a child into our home and lie about where she came from? How could you make me love her while hiding the truth? As the argument escalated, Emma wandered into the room, clutching her stuffed bunny. What's going on? She asked, her small voice cutting through the tension. Margaret immediately softened, kneeling to Emma's level. It's okay, sweetheart. We're just talking. Tony crouched beside Emma, his voice gentle. Emma, do you remember when I said I was your daddy? Emma nodded, her big brown eyes wide. Well, that's true, Tony said. I'm your daddy, And I love you very much. Emma looked between Tony and Richard, confusion written on her face. But I already have a daddy. Margaret placed a reassuring hand on Emma's shoulder. You have someone who has always loved you, Emma. Tony is your real daddy, and he's going to be a big part of your life now. Richard stiffened, his jaw clenched. This is ridiculous. You're confusing her. But Margaret ignored him, her focus entirely on Emma. Later that evening, Margaret made a decision that would change everything. She packed her belongings and moved out of the house, taking Emma with her temporarily. She explained to Tony that she needed time to transition Emma to her new life and wanted to keep her away from Richard's toxic influence. Richard was furious, but there was little he could do. His lies had caught up to him, and he was left alone in the house that had once been filled with love and laughter. Over the next few weeks, Tony spent more time with Emma, building their bond. They went to the park, baked cookies, and painted together. Emma began to trust him, her initial confusion giving way to joy and curiosity. One day, as they sat on a bench overlooking a lake, Emma asked, "Did Mama know you were my daddy?" Tony's throat tightened. Yes, she knew. She loved you very much and wanted you to be happy. Emma smiled. I think she'd be happy we're together now. Tony nodded, tears welling in his eyes. I think so too. Meanwhile, Margaret finalized her divorce from Richard. She couldn't forgive his lies or his betrayal, and she knew she deserved better. I hope you find peace, Richard, she told him during their final meeting. But I can't be part of your life anymore. Richard said nothing, his pride preventing him from admitting his mistakes. As Margaret prepared to hand full custody of Emma to Tony, she spent one last evening with the little girl she had loved as her own. You're going to be so happy with your daddy, Margaret told Emma, her voice thick with emotion. He loves you more than anything in the world. Emma hugged her tightly. I'll miss you. Margaret kissed her forehead. I'll miss you too, but we'll see each other again. You're a very special little girl, Emma. When Tony took Emma home for the first time, he felt a sense of fulfillment he hadn't experienced in years. His house, once quiet and lonely, was now filled with the sound of Emma's laughter. As he tucked her into bed that night, he whispered, I'll always take care of you, Emma. Promise? Emma smiled sleepily, her hand clutching his. I love you, Daddy. Tony's heart swelled with emotion. I love you too, sweetheart,